Good morning. We're going to get started. We have a tight schedule again today because we want to hear all of your wonderful scholarship. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And our first session this morning is energy resources and infrastructure. Our three panelists this morning will be Phil White from Brandeis, Ryan Tate from Rutgers, and Jonathan Payton from the University of Manitoba. And our commentator today is Brian Craner. And as all of them have lovely bios in our program, I'm going to lie right past that and just simply ask Phil, come on up and get us started this morning.
Thank you, Kevin. Alrighty, let's jump right into it. The historical geography of the Great Plains facilitated the innovation and expansion of the world's most capacious hydrocarbon pipelines. In turn, the construction and endurance of this system had profound implications for the people and environment of the Great Plains. Pipelines were not simply a passive element in the petroleum supply chain. They were arguably the most important mechanism for the production, transportation, and control of hydrocarbons. Being so consequential, pipelines provide a lens to understand the changing environmental history and present controversies of the Great Plains. I was going to open this with a video from Standing Rock, but we'll see where it goes instead, because I think there's certainly plenty of space to discuss that controversy. That's certainly what inspired this research, as well as Keystone itself. While pipelines crisscross the continent, the Great Plains has a unique historical relationship with this energy transmission technology. The United States, historically the world's greatest producer and consumer of fossil fuels, has more pipelines than any other nation. The highest concentration of pipelines runs from Texas to Alberta, transiting the interior plains and the Great Plains. Specifically, the Great Plains host a critical network of long-distance trunk lines, the longest, most capacious, and most critical pipeline infrastructure. So there's plenty of, in different maps that you look at with pipelines, you'll see plenty of gathering lines, which are the local short transmission pipelines. And those are important as well, but for the purposes of my research, I'm focusing on interstate trunk lines because they're the most important ones. This energy geography is a product of geology, political economy, and culture. During the Cretaceous period, an inland sea teeming with prehistoric marine life dominated the Great Plains region. As this western interior seaway, its formal name, receded, it produced relatively flat terrain and trapped vast deposits of decaying marine life that would in time become hydrocarbons. The equatorial position of the Great Plains during the Cenozoic and Carboniferous eras also encouraged the formation of huge deposits of petroleum, natural gas, and coal. Millions of years later, the receding interior seaway landlocked many of the largest deposits in the mid-continent, trapping them hundreds of miles from major waterways, or sometimes less than 100 miles, but still tricky to get out when waterways are humanity's historically most easiest and most utilized paths for transportation. Far more than just a region of oil and gas extraction, the political economy of petroleum production and consumption gave rise to the Great Plains as the critical geographical space for the transmission of U.S., Canadian, and foreign hydrocarbons. Reserves of fossil fuels are characterized by their highly uneven distribution. Therefore, as humanity began utilizing liquid fossil energy on an industrial scale in the late 19th century, the location of these reserves and their proximity to consumers became a major concern. Energy markets fundamentally operate on geography. The vast geographical gulf between energy resources and energy consumers gave rise to the sprawling Great Plains pipeline system. And here's another Exxon map that basically shows the same thing that first map did. The pipeline networks of the Great Plains always exerted environmental change far beyond their narrow physical footprints and wrought tremendous ecological consequences in three specific ways. First, by enabling the economic utilization of oil fields throughout the regions, pipelines precipitated the growth of the petroleum industry. Crude is not worth much at the wellhead and must be transported to market to be of significant value. Pipelines transformed the economic potential of landlocked oil fields and made these energy reserves into economic resources. Fields that lacked access to pipelines languished, but experienced rapid development once efficient and reliable overland transportation corridors were established. Quite simply, pipelines throttled production. It's one of my major arguments that I'd like to make in this paper. These energy infrastructures were active agents in creating the, quote, geography of mass consumption, to use Matthew Huber's term, throughout the Great Plains and continent. Second, the construction of the Great Plains pipeline network facilitated considerable, quote unquote, environmental distancing and made energy more invisible to the average consumer. The environmental history of North America is contoured by the transportation of energy and commodities in general over longer and longer distances. As the single most important technology for the overland transportation of hydrocarbons, pipelines enabled the geographical separation of producers from consumers. This is not a new argument in environmental history, but I think it has important implications for pipelines. These trunk lines were nothing less than a transportation revolution, on par with canals and railroads in their ability to economically and efficiently move product to market. And depending on the product, they were more efficient than either of those two systems, also depending on the geography. These energy transportation systems facilitated the linking of rural resource hinterlands to energy metropolises. As Kathy and her fellow co-creators of the book on energy metropolises well know, creating deeply imbricated national and international markets. The Great Plains were at the heart of this geographical nexus. Third, pipelines exerted a paradoxical role in the conservation and consumption of fossil fuels. Before the innovation of pipeline systems, large volumes of oil and gas were wasted because drillers could not control petroleum flows. And even after pipelines are crisscrossing the nation, if your oil field is not connected to a pipeline, it's very hard, especially in the early years, it's very hard to regulate the output, and waste was endemic to those sites. With the advent of pipelines, corporations were able to capture more fossil energy and deliver it to consumers with significantly less waste. Paradoxically, while pipelines enabled the local conservation of petroleum, the tremendous ability to transport hydrocarbons efficiently, reliably, and inexpensively encouraged greater consumption of fossil fuels. The environmental consequences of fossil fuel consumption were manifest immediately through local spills, fires, and transformed landscapes. Most profoundly, though, in time, scientists revealed the fossil fuel economy's altering of the chemical composition of the atmosphere and oceans. And I just want to talk briefly about the genesis of hydrocarbon pipelines, because it establishes some important precedents for the history of the industry and the Great Plains. Colonel Edwin Drake's discovery of petroleum in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859 and the ensuing oil rush spurred the invention of modern pipelines. Oil production boomed from only a few hundred barrels per year before Drake's discovery to 3 million barrels in 1862. As drillers extracted larger volumes, transportation emerged as the greatest challenge. In the late summer and fall of 1865, the entrepreneur Samuel Van Hickel laid the world's first major crude oil pipeline for 5 miles. The 2-inch pipeline had a total of 3 steam-powered pumps that forced 81 barrels of oil per hour through the line, the daily equivalent of 300 workers hauling barrels for 10 hours. The relatively efficient system soon put hundreds of men out of work. Enraged, they sabotaged the pipeline with pickaxes and explosives and set fire to nearby storage tanks. The animus of workers against some of these technological systems or unions, I think, is something that our talks will have in common. Only when the pipeline company hired a local sheriff and armed men to guard the pipeline did the workers back down. And this was a narrow and short line. This was a gathering line. This is like the first major gathering line. So this solved the problem of local transmission, but John D. Rockefeller still had full collusion with the railroads. He still controlled most of the refineries. There was still this issue of how do you transport hydrocarbons over longer distances. And so this is where we get the Tidewater pipeline. In the late 1870s, a group of businessmen decided to circumvent Standard Oil's strangulation of the oil regions by building an innovative 109-mile trunk line. Trunk, the terminology trunk stems from the Old French tronc, which means the trunk of a tree or the trunk of a human body, and it was first used in 1843 for railroads. So that's where that comes from. This Tidewater pipeline project required enormous sums of capital, expertise, and new technology. Throughout 1879, surveyors, engineers, and laborers struggled to construct the pipeline through the grueling terrain of the Allegheny Mountains and against frequent sabotage attempts by railroads. Finally, at a hefty cost of $750,000, oil flowed successfully through the world's first trunk line. The pipeline, according to oil historian Daniel Yergin, was a major technological achievement comparable to the Brooklyn Bridge 4 years later. Reacting to the success of Tidewater, Standard soon constructed 4 long-distance pipelines from the oil regions to Cleveland, New York City, Philadelphia, and Buffalo. The age of interstate trunk lines had arrived. Which takes us to the Great Plains. Prospectors scoured the Midwest and Great Plains for 30 years after Drake's discovery, with little luck in the Great Plains. But all that changed in the 1890s. On November 28, 1892, William Mill's steel drill bit hit a hydrocarbon reservoir at 832 feet below Neodesha, Kansas, and introduced the Great Plains to the flourishing age of petroleum development. Indian Territory followed suit in 1897, when prospectors unleashed a gusher near Bartlesville. I think I'm saying that right. Wildcatters soon revealed the contours of the Mid-Continent Field, which stretched 75 miles wide and 175 miles long. Within the first decades of the 20th century, more than 30,000 wells penetrated the field. The oil industry considered it to be the biggest oil field in the world. As it had done in Pennsylvania and the Lima, Indiana oil fields, Standard moved quickly to control the flow of oil. Like all other technologies, pipelines are political from their inception. Standard and the other oil firms are deploying them to combat labor, to take control of the petroleum market. In 1900, Prairie Oil, Standard Oil's local agent, built the first trunk line of the Great Plains, an 8-inch diameter line spanning 160 miles from Humboldt to Sugar Creek, Kansas. Prairie also built an entire network of gathering pipelines necessary to bring the Mid-Continent field to sustained high production. Thanks to the power of these pipelines, Standard had, quote, complete control over the output in Kansas. But they weren't done there. In March of 1904, a stunning announcement swept the oil industry. Standard declared that it would construct an unprecedented pipeline to transport mid-continent crude to Chicago and beyond. At 800 miles in length, the line was staggeringly expensive and would give Standard sole control of exporting mid-continent petroleum. The idea elicited scoffs and jeers from many oilmen. Quote, "It is looked upon as too ridiculous a proposition to be even taken seriously," end quote. One reporter quipped. But despite the incredulity of its critics, by 1905, Standard had constructed, quote, the longest pipeline in the world. And this map doesn't fully show its extent, but it's stretching all the way from Kansas to New York Harbor and eventually down into Oklahoma. And this map is from 1929, so a little later, but it gives a good sense of the geography. The pipeline was to become a template for a century of transcontinental energy transportation that was relatively reliable, invisible, and inexpensive. These early years of experimentation and innovation also laid important social expectations concerning the flow of inexpensive energy, the bounty of the Great Plains, and the possibilities for an energetic future. The early pipelines on the these early pipelines were technological marvels, but they also wrought enduring ecological consequences. While many leaks were small, breaches in major trunk lines could become terrifying events. On March 27, 1904, Standard's 12-inch trunk line from the oil fields of Indiana to its Cleveland refinery as part of its mainline system that it built just after the success of the Tidewater pipeline in Pennsylvania, broke southwest of the Ohio town of Berea. There's not many newspaper accounts that I can find of massive pipeline ruptures, but this is one of them. And even though it's not in the Great Plains proper, it really highlights that when their major lines broke, it could become tremendous problems. And basically, the oil line breaks into this creek. It's more like a small river. Somebody sets fire to it. There's a massive conflagration. And it takes Standard a long time to shut off this line. There's no automatic pipeline shut-off valves. They have to go out and manually shut off the valve at the closest pump station. The case of Berea highlights that pipelines immerse rural residents in the fossil fuel pollution of the industrial era. Despite fouling the environment all along their routes, pipelines also played a crucial role in conservation. In new fields without pipelines, tremendous volumes of oil and gas were wasted. And this is exemplified, I talked about in my paper, by Wyoming Salt Creek Field before they had pipeline access there. Twice every month, they would have to burn thousands of barrels of oil just to keep it from overflowing into the farmers' fields. So that's part of the paradoxical relation of pipeline development. The first 3 decades of the 20th century also witnessed an extraordinary construction period for pipelines. This was especially due to the advent of the internal combustion engine, which had enormous implications for both agriculture and mobility throughout the country. The transition of fossil fuels from motive energy ushered in a new era for agriculture. Gasoline-powered tractors brought enormous changes for American farming communities across the Great Plains. 1918 witnessed quote-unquote peak horse for U.S. farmers as 85,000 tractors and 89,000 trucks limited horses' use and need. More than 10 animals disappeared for every tractor introduced. In conjunction with other equipment, these energetic behemoths resulted in a 50% reduction in the time required to plow. And this also had the effect of more than 3 million people leaving agriculture during the decade. And during these decades, the 1910s, the 1920s, the mid-continent field was absolutely the most important oil fields in America. I mean, California is rising, but the majority of Americans' liquid hydrocarbons are coming from the mid-continent. And so, there's a number of different technological innovations that allow pipelines to get longer, to operate at higher pressures. This has to do with the innovation of steel. More powerful and reliable diesel pumps were utilized, and significant advances in electric welding and protective anti-corrosion coatings. So this allows for long-distance natural gas pipelines and long-distance product pipelines. Product pipelines are those that carry kerosene, diesel, any refined petroleum product. And so one of the arguments that I'm making is that as pipelines expand throughout the Great Plains, they carry a larger and larger diversity of hydrocarbon cargoes. And so they're incredibly flexible. And then, so the largest of the product pipelines was something called the Great Lakes Pipeline. And this was really important because it distributed gasoline all throughout the Great Plains. And the Great Plains utilized far more gasoline per capita than other areas of the country. People had longer rural commutes. They're utilizing tractors or using a lot more fuel. So these product pipelines were specifically important to the Great Plains region. In my paper, I talk about the inch lines during World War II, which were very innovative pipelines that helped lay some of the technological foundations for the post-war era. But the pipeline infrastructure that we know today was really built in the first decades after World War II. There was a tremendous boom in construction. Up to 16,000 miles were being constructed each year. And thanks to this, in 1948, I find this remarkable, for the first time, more natural gas was utilized, the energy was actually utilized for it in homes and industries rather than being flared directly into the environment, or released directly into the environment as it had been for the majority of the oil industry's history. And so these are some of the major natural gas lines that were built in the early post-war era. And the other thing I want to talk about is the imbrication of the Canadian and American petroleum economies. And this really begins in 1947 with the discovery of major oil reserves in Leduc, Alberta, and the construction of the interprovincial and lakehead pipeline system that goes all the way down to Clear Brook, Minnesota, and to Point South. This system is now Enbridge's mainline system, and it's the longest and most capacious liquid hydrocarbon transportation system in the world. That one specific line which transits the Great Plains and obviously is so important in really throttling the production of Canada's tar sands in time. So in the historical record, there's relatively few articles that discuss people's oppositions to pipelines. They generally revolve around property rights. Sometimes there's unions who are upset that they don't get contract, so we have some pipeline bombings because unions are angry. But really, this is a fairly familiar story. We have to get into the post-war era where people really begin to rethink the fossil fuel pollution that came from hydrocarbon pipeline systems. And what I'm arguing in my dissertation is actually the Trans-Alaska pipeline controversy was the first time we have a major debate about utility and function of pipelines and their environmental influence. And basically there was a big debate whether or not to route the Alaska pipeline through Canada. And arguably, it was kind of ironic. Environmentalists really wanted to do that because they said if you have oil tankers offshore, you're going to have a spill. And obviously that happened with the Exxon Valdez. But they ended up doing a quote-unquote all-American route because they couldn't trust the Canadians, which is really ironic considering the Keystone XL and now Canada wants to route pipelines to the United States. But once the Trans-Alaska pipeline was built and the oil was brought down to the West Coast, they wanted a way to bring it to the Great Plains and the East Coast, which there was a glut of oil on the West Coast. And so there was this proposed northern tier pipeline. Politicians all over the Great Plains were in favor of it. This was going to bring jobs. This was right in the midst of the 79 oil crisis. But the residents of Washington were unwilling to put up with the potential oil spills from both tankers and the pipeline in the Puget Sound area. And so this is the first example I can find of a pipeline being defeated on environmental grounds. This is in 1982, even though they pitched the project and really got it going in 1975. I just want to read one more paragraph to conclude here. The Great Plains evoke images of amber waves of grain and an enduring agrarian ideal that underlies the notion of the American heartland. Focusing on extensive pipeline networks crisscrossing the plains reveals an alternative environmental history of the region. These pipelines suggest a region that is no less agrarian, but far more about industrial capitalism and mechanized agriculture than nostalgic mythologies of pre-industrial farming. The modern Great Plains thrives on cheap fossil energy, seized land, and the furtive movement of petroleum products. Thanks to the technology of long-distance pipelines, the Great Plains are not only the breadbasket of North America, they are an energy heartland, a region of petroleum arteries, gas veins, and carbon conduits, supplying the continent with powerful and perilous fossil energy.
I just wanted to apologize to our speakers. So actually, Kathy's running the clock on this, so I spoke prematurely, so let her run the show, and I'll comment later.
This is about right?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. My dissertation began with a really simple question. It was, how did the Northern Great Plains become coal country? How did Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas go from producing less than 1% of American coal in 1960 to producing more than half and accounting for most of the world's U.S. coal exports by the 1980s? And when I started the project, I realized really quickly that I was actually taking up kind of a corrective endeavor. Right? The 2016 presidential election, I think coal featured in our presidential politics for maybe the first time in like 50 years, probably not since Robert Kennedy toward the abolition of coal fields. But our understandings of coal was still kind of stuck in the past. Most coal isn't produced in Appalachia, it's produced out west. Most coal is produced underground, it's produced above ground through surface mining. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today, and also some of the oppositional politics that developed locally on the ground in these places of overburden. Edward Abbey once called the Northern Great Plains a land of almost painful beauty, an unforgiving environment that can beckon and repel. Most Americans, I remind people out east by Rutgers, have never visited this rural and sparsely populated place, but many have an instinctive sense of the landscape. It's a staple of American folklore, popular myth-making, the West, of our cinematic imagination. And There is an engulfing presence out here of the chiseled layers of deep time, of the obscure ages of the Cretaceous and the Cambrian. But despite the broad and rugged reputation, the region has always been, ecologically speaking, a somewhat thin and delicate place. The rain averages less than 15 inches a year, and the topsoil is sometimes easily blown away. But beneath these western soils lay half of all American coal reserves. So I'm talking about this region right here. Our Appalachian coal fields, we're focused on here in the Northern Plains. We have the Midwest coal fields as well, and central Illinois. Now, these low sulfur bituminous and lignite rocks are sometimes only 30 feet deep. These geological formations in the Northern Plains account for actually about 20% of the world's coal reserves. For tens of thousands of years, they played almost no role in human ways of life. Great Plains Indians and the first whites in the region did record coal outcroppings and may have burned lignite for heat. But they lived without tapping the reserves of fossil fuels underground. Even after the development of the skills and the knowledge to extract coal, the Western mines powered railroads, front-range homes, labor wars, but they never amounted to a large share of national production. That all changed in the 1960s when a coal rush engulfed the Northern Plains. A constellation of political and economic forces spurred the Western migration of acquisitive energy firms, the labor unrest of the Appalachian coal fields, the air pollution control standards of the Clean Air Act, threatened the industry's razor-thin profit margins out east. The coal companies diversified and invested their capital into the western coal fields, where non-union workforces and low sulfur coal promised new opportunity. The onset of the 1973 oil crisis accelerated the shifting geography of coal production. As the nation's most abundant fossil fuel, coal found favor amid the political imperatives to secure energy independence. American policymakers and industry leaders doubled down on coal as what they called the pivotal fuel and the fuel for tomorrow, under the presumed threat that foreign oil posed to uphold food addictions. So by that nationalist creed, for the good of the nation, energy conglomerates rushed into Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas to peel back and strip mine the wide and still unskimmed seams. The expansion of strip mining wrought one of the greatest environmental changes to the region since the geological process that formed over 65 million years ago. The large earth-moving machines assembled ecosystems at a scale and a speed almost unknown after human war. Now, most histories of coal have overlooked the industry's last 100 years. Yet open-pit mines, wherever they're found, have served as a startling and vivid example of the brute force exploitation of resources. The sheer scale of these operations seem to epitomize for historians and for critical journalists the human incursion into the deep time, the Anthropocene. Indeed, in the late 20th century, the forces of mining moved more earth than did natural erosion. Yet, as is often the case, the big picture can sometimes distort our realities closer to the ground and make it difficult to see the subtle but no less significant ways in which the political ecology of coal materialized on the Northern Plains. The coal rush of the late 20th century transformed and applied places of overburden, those local environments where mining and reclamation remade the land and the social power relationships the land represented. So overburden is the industry term for the disposable ecosystem. All the soil, all the plants, all the rocks, the animal life that mines tear apart to move coal from the ground. But the overburden was also a cultural and economic place. The homes and the workscapes of the white ranchers, the Northern Cheyenne and Crow Indians who lived and labored above these coal fields. So today I want to track the material life of the overburden, from its disassembly by the big machines to its reclamation by technical consultants, in order to understand how strip mining impinged on these service ecosystems and communities. The expressive urgency of giant scars and mass destruction that animates historians and I think writers today looking at these scenes did not have the same organizing power in the 1970s on the Northern Plains. Rather, the politics of strip mining erupted forcefully over changes in the region's microenvironments. It provoked a quest for knowledge and understanding of immediate life worlds, of the grass, of the water, toward what anthropologist Tim Ingold calls local ontologies of engagement, of the places dwelt in and inhabited. So, before the 1960s, if you opened a strip mine, you basically operated under the assumption that it was going to be a sacrifice area. Mining companies investigated potential sites, they invested the capital to research markets, they estimated profits. So to get at coal, once this fair infrastructure was in place, they used heavy machinery to skin the vegetation rock strata from several hundred acres of land above the coal field. So the operation, strip mining, you think of it like peeling back the surface of the earth, but it also moves laterally across the coal field in strips. So it's actually moving in this direction, and they undertake both mining and reclaiming of the land at the same time. So here they're removing the soils from the top, so I'll talk about, here they're mining the coal, they throw the excess waste here, and then they will go back and try to revegetate the land. The operation will all take place at once. So they shade the topsoil, dump the loose dirt in temporary stockpiles, which are the ridges, like miniature mountains that you can actually see for many miles across the low-slung prairies. Once miners remove the vegetation in topsoil, they dig the first pit. Since coal has been formed from geological compaction, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil explosives to break the earth overlying the coal seams. The most experienced operators are those who operate the mammoth drag lines, which are the main workhorse of the mine. These are long-neck machines with booms taller than the Statue of Liberty. They weigh more than a heavy naval warship. It takes 100 workers 18 months to build one of these, and they have to build it on site because it's too heavy to ship. They reassemble, as the Western writer Ivan Goey put it, technical mirages of the earlier dinosaurs who roamed these plains. These drag lines set the pace of production. They operate 24 hours a day, 360 days a year. In the cockpit are highly experienced technicians, several stories off the ground, who shift the joysticks and pedals to work the rhythmic cables that pull the scoop and take bites out of the earth. When they reach the coal seam, drillers again blast it, and the dragline shovel shovel coal into haul trucks that queue at its side. It takes a few minutes to load about 400 tons of coal. The drivers of these gigantic trucks then dump the coal into mounds of black dust at the pickles, where machines crush the coal and conveyors transport it to storage silos and load-out facilities. If companies had utility power plants built nearby, then coal glides across the pit in fast-moving conveyor belts directly from the crusher to the mine power plant. These can burn about a boxcar full of coal every 5 to 10 minutes. And they basically have powered most of the cities in the Middle West through high-voltage transmission lines with this coal wire. Predominantly, most of this coal was going at this time in the early 70s from Minneapolis and Chicago. This work of strip mining became more involved in the late 60s. The disassembly of the ecosystem now ran concurrent with mandates to start to put it back together again. The northern tier states all passed reclamation laws amid awakened public sympathies for environmental action. In concert with the introduction of the environmental impact statement in '69, companies now require a wealth of information and inventories about proposed mining sites and their post-mining use. So reclamation laws required workers to refill areas that have been mined out with overburden, grade the terrain with paving equipment, reseed the land with a mix of grasses and shrubs to create a revegetated ecosystem. That's what's going on the right side of the picture. The process was expensive. It's close to $25,000 per acre. Now, the science behind reclamation in these early years was actually pretty rough and experimental. Most knowledge of reclamation came from some academic studies that had been done in the 40s and the 50s, and some contract work from the surface mining industry. There have been really no efforts at rehabilitation of the land, and no long-term experiments in shaping and revegetating western lands. There was little doubt that the reclamation of the semi-arid west proposed near impossible feats of engineering. Strip mining destroyed the structure of the soil and the grass, the texture, the sweetness and sourness of its chemical makeup, its moisture. Dumping spoonfuls of topsoil into a mound of overburden actually buried the surface suitable for plant growth at the bottom and upturned strata that had never before supported life. As coal company geologists put it, to think that we can level the land and eventually have fields of grass belly deep with tall steer is unrealistic, of course. The National Academy of Sciences, the restoration of a landscape disturbed by surface mining in the sense of recreating the former conditions is not possible. In the 1960s, coal developers used this uncertainty about reclamation to help craft the field's methodology and analysis. In Wyoming, the restoration program fell to the discretion of the mine operator. Operators had to recover and revegetate the coal seam only if it was practical. In Montana and North Dakota, operators had to return the land to what they called useful production, meaning to some degree of revegetation for grazing or crop harvesting in lakes or ponds or even industrial sites. But after 2 seedings of an area was considered reclaimed even if nothing could grow on it. None of these states had any provisions for failures to comply. So the idea that the industry could tear apart the earth and reassemble it ignored ecological collisions that transpired in the process of development There was no ignoring the fundamental transformations of the earth when it changed the industry can from ecosystems into overburden. So area ranchers and Northern Plains Indians knew the extraction and harnessing of coal energy precluded other uses of the land. State laws offered little guidance about how to restore surface productivity, even though agriculture and ranching dominated the land above the coal fields. As rancher Wallace McCrae asked, is there any assurance the land in the hundreds of thousands of acres of other prospective mining land in the West will ever be returned to productivity? The politics that first constrained the energy boom then sprouted from efforts to protect these ordinary things, the grass and the water. Grasslands overlaid about 60% of the coal reserves in the region, the most of any ecosystem. Yet state reclamation laws failed to consider the impact of mining on the grass. The Northern Cheyenne and the Crow expressed their early concerns about the grasslands and the risks that coal posed to agricultural pursuits. But grass perhaps mattered most of all to ranchers because it served their interests as capitalists. In the ranching business, cattle are the principal means for accumulating wealth, but cattle can only store wealth if they're properly fed on the somatic energy stored in the grass surface. That makes control of sustainable grasslands a political enterprise. The region's high-calorie short grasses stored vast amounts of solar energy and provided sufficient nutrients for livestock grazing. The land as it stands, said the rancher Ellen Cotton, is more valuable than the coal underneath it. Cattle can grow to a good weight here without needing to be fed on any grain. There's hardly any other place in America like this. Indeed, the region's ground cover and plant life had evolved with the hoofs and the teeth and the dung of the bred-up herds. The ownership of the western land came second to securing what Patricia Limit once called the property in grass. Now, ranchers had their own knowledge about the pattern ecology and how best to reclaim it. The practice of ranch work had imparted them with some knowledge of the region's bio. Ranchers used their vernacular sense of the land to lobby administrative and legal authorities for what they called a native grass criterion in reclamation. They understood that the size and the growth of perennial grasses to be the most reliable indicator of successful reclamation. As the rancher Bob Tully put it, native grasses are the key to whether or not the land can be restored to a balanced condition. The Reddings were haunted the Westmoreland Coal Company because they refused to sell out. They were, but the irony here is that they actually owned they ranched over the top of coal that was actually owned by the Crow Indians. And so the ranchers, the very conservative ranchers, teamed up with the Sierra Club to actually sue the Crows when they decided to develop their coal seams, which I'll get to later. The ranchers' vision of these native grasses chafed against the ongoing reduction of dispassionate scientific knowledge by reclamation authorities. Coal companies hired consultants to seize local resistance by establishing showcase plots near the mine mouths. Mike Grande, for instance, the reclamation manager of Montana Power Company, planted 27 varieties of irrigated and fertilized grass on the plot at the strip mine near Colstrip. The native grasses grew tall and thick. He told ranchers that cattle could graze within 5 years. This shows reclamation can be done in those days. The forecasting, however, took little account of history, the chances in the future as in the past, the seasonality of rainfall, wind, temperature, humidity, seeding, animal habits might fall below average or fail to reproduce the control variables of the studies. Ranchers played muckraker to these demonstration sites. They dubbed them lipstick on a corpse. They pointed out that most of the reclaimed land stood in a high visibility area along highways. Most disturbed lands further inland where they ranched were unreclaimed. Other concerned ranchers, like Ed Dobson, toured surrounding communities like the Rays to provide presentations about corporate malfeasance. At one meeting, he clicked through a slide projector showing reclamation sites. Well, now that's pretty, he said, displaying a picture of a demonstration plot. But they don't tell you that they hauled in 6 inches of topsoil, used 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 60 pounds of phosphorus, and seeded with 160 pounds of seed per acre. Another rancher said, I could grow that in the back of my truck. Other ranchers in Northern Plains Indians worried that the greatest threat for mining and reclamation was the one they couldn't always see, the so-called hidden problem of water. Mining scrambled the geological layers of the earth and pulled rock and coal strata out of the sequences of decline, and dumping the spoil back into a mixed mash of landfill. In Appalachia, actually, much of the damage done by strip mining was the result from water. The acid drainage, the erosion, the sedimentation. But on the northern plains, where water was more scarce, the most severe problem was maintaining the hydraulic function. The semi-arid climate that meant that mined areas could not be reclaimed just by being reshaped and revegetated, as was common in the eastern coal fields. The ranchers and Northern Plains Indians thus fretted over the impact of mining on natural water systems. The amount of water the coal operations used and the quality of water that the industry was going to leave behind. The most difficult project of mine reclamation was rebuilding the groundwater systems. The blasting of rock had opened fissures and cracks within and below the seams that cut off natural drainage patterns. The coal seams and the sandstone layers above them were the most prized aquifers in the region. The coal, in other words, acted as a kind of stacked underground pipeline system for subsurface water resources. When the layers of coal were peeled away, huge chunks of earth dried up and muddied the wells and springs. The ranchers and Indians in the northern plains soon referred to strip mining as aquifer removal. The coal industry's demands on water competed with proposed agricultural use. Reservation agriculture and rangeland grazing depended on the precious water supplies of the upper Missouri Basin. Strip mining lowered the water tables in the area. Even ranchers and reservations far from the mines reported problems with their wells. The actual process of strip mining required very little water, but power generation and coal gasification nearby mine power plants required vast amounts to produce steam generators and flush out any waste products. Coal companies rerouted these water courses and channels towards industrial sites. In the early phases of preparation, a Montana State Task Force admitted, quote, little is known about the actual levels of water consumption. Once development began, the results were more clear. At a typical power plant like Colstrip, they consume 22,000 gallons of water every minute, most of it piped from the Yellowstone River. At the reservoir, the company banked a 50-day supply, which also served as the town's recreational facility. The post-mining degradation of these waters created long-term concerns about the region's producers. The mines had drained water into mine pits, contaminated with acid runoff, and polluting it with toxic materials. Groundwater studies found such high concentrations of minerals and sodium that the water was useless for irrigation. Irrigating vegetation greatly stopped. All around the range and towns, the companies also built ponds to contain industrial waste. These were called settling ponds, where the waste sunk to the bottom and then workers dredged it and trucked it to nearby dump sites. In the warm weather, they used evaporation ponds, where the operators pumped wastewater through a sprinkler system to evaporate it into the air. The waste from these ponds worked its way into water tables, local and regional creeks and rivers. Acceptable leakage by the industry standards amounted to thousands of gallons of wastewater each day. Area ranchers and more than 40% of the Northern Cheyenne tribe considered this, quote, environmental damage and loss of resources intolerable. Nearly all refused to allow water pollution on their reservation or near their homes. As one Northern Cheyenne woman protested, we've always had clean air, good water, our land is very good, why ruin it now? Strip mining transformed these ecosystems and communities into literal and metaphoric sites of overburden. The subtle shifts in the area's grass and water provoked mass discontent because it reshaped the environments and sustained existing habits of life. The contested management and restoration of the overburden then provided the first avenue for political activism against strip mining on the northern plains. During the early and contingent period of coal development, ranchers and native communities organized their political opposition by drawing untoward attention to the reclamation of the land. When the land agents arrived at Carol Alderson's ranch, she told them plainly, do not make the mistake of lumping us and the land all together as overburden and dispense with us as nuisances. Before the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council in the summer of 1972, Ted Rivenson told his peers, we have these hills and grass and trees and streams, and if we don't give it to them, then no one can take it away from us. Ranchers from surrounding areas pooled their resources and rallied together to gain accurate information on development procedures. These communities first organized county-level protective associations. They later organized in the state societies to preserve what rancher Walter McCrae called intrinsic value, things of intrinsic worth. Ranchers used their political clout to push legislative proposals at the state level to force mining firms to return strip mine land to productive work for their draft version of a new state reclamation act. The law was passed in March 1973, prescribing greater restoration of native vegetation, the original contour of the landscape, in addition to greater oversight procedures. Recognizing the need to apply these across state lines, many of the ranchers joined the national movement against strip mining. This was at the time led since the 1960s by mostly working-class residents in Appalachia and their legislators. The Westerners, however, inserted in the first draft of the Surface Control and Reclamation Act several Western issues, like reclamation standards for agricultural productivity, the restoration of hydraulic balance to water resources. The Northern Cheyenne and the Crow organized independently from ranchers and each other. They faced the particulars of coal development on their own reservations, and within the emergent political activism in Indian nations during the 1960s and 1970s. These Indian nations had carved out new pathways of political identity. Strip mining renewed attention to the federal government's paternalistic control over Indian lands and waters and resources. These indigenous communities drew on national and global movements for civil rights and decolonization, but they also conveyed a distinct sense of post-colonial nationalism, an attempt, as Vine Deloria Jr. wrote, to recolonize indigenous political life. Coal development on reservation land provided opportunity to organize anew on the ground of native sovereignty. Both tribes sought to connect their environmental degradation on their land to the political economy. Reservations first challenged the rational underbidding of coal leases. The tribal councils diverged in the management of the resources. The Crows sought to make something of what they called their white elephant of coal. The Northern Cheyenne gained a reputation as anti-development for their earnest opposition. The coal boom would accelerate on the Northern Plains in the 1970s and the 1980s. The West soon began producing more coal than the Northern and Southern Appalachian coal fields combined. The oppositional politics would take new forms as the year progressed and unite diverse and strained bedfellows. But the origins of coal opposition in the Northern Plains took root at the places of overburden, where typologies of grass and water found regional identities and ways of life to the land.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Morning.
Just like class. Thanks very much to Bill and Ryan. It's great to be on the panel. Those are really, really rich papers, empirically really rich, conceptually lots of stuff to chew on there. So I'm glad to be on a panel with you both, but also frustrated because I have a million questions which I won't be able to ask. So we'll save that for later. And thanks as well to Kathy and Brian. A thank you, but also an apology because I was delinquent. I sent my paper very late, and I changed my title, and probably other trespasses as well. So thank you. I'm sorry. So I want to start with this image to give you the to confirm your impression that Canadians are totally quaint. But also to give you a sense of how oil cultures in the Canadian prairies can be read as a historical representation. So this is an image of a Zamboni in the Burden Rink. What I want you to focus on in this image is the actual decal on the side of the Zamboni. You've got representations. You got three different representations here. You have a wheat economy, you have an oil economy, but what you also have is Tundra Oil and Gas, the Tundra Oil and Gas Partnership. Tundra Oil and Gas is the largest producer of oil in Manitoba, run by the Richardson family, one of the richest families in Manitoba, one of the richest families in Canada, one of the families that has single-handedly shaped the political economy of the Canadian prairies. This will give you a sense of the kind of historical representations that I'm going to be talking about today. This will place you in Manitoba, a place that exists in your minds probably, but many of you won't know where it is. This is Manitoba. This hints at a different kind of analysis here, one that sees the landscape vertically, as opposed to the horizontal representations that many of you have given us today. I'm reminded, Matt had this beautiful phrase just at the end of your talk there, where you talked about scrambling the geological, mining is something that scrambles the geological layers of the earth, and that's something that I think is evocative, or is evoked in this image here. I'm going to be talking about the southwest section of Manitoba there, where you can see that there is a different kind of geology present. So what I do, for those of you who've read my paper, I talk about Manitoba oil cultures through a series of oil encounters or oil stories. And the question here is, how do these stories produce different kinds of histories? We start with two stories: the Fontana story, the story of August Fontana, an 88-year-old Italian immigrant farmer near the town of Verdun who sold his land to the Canadian government in 1940 in a fit of patriotic fervor, so that the federal government could build an aviation training facility during the Second World War. He sued the government later in 1954 because they sold the mineral rights to that property, which they said they didn't want, to Gulf Oil. He sold it for $9,000. They sold the mineral rights for $200,000. He was unsuccessful and died later that year in 1954, effectively in a halfway house in Brandon, Manitoba, close to Verdun. The other story I tell is a different kind of oil story. That's the story of the McIver family. Came to Manitoba from Skye, Scotland in 1881, built a prosperous farm of wheat and rapeseed and other market vegetables. His grandsons in the 1950s drilled oil on their land on a lark, and kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies, they struck oil and effectively started the oil boom in the area around the town of Verdun, Manitoba. These are two different kinds of stories that produce different kinds of oil histories in and around Verdun. The discourse that powerful interests speak through or circumscribe is one of resources. So the key becomes analyzing the moment that a certain resource becomes utterable. A certain resource becomes something that we can talk about within a kind of everyday register. In the instance of oil or resources, we denaturalize its place in economics or politics, or even at the dinner table. We can look to the point where it's brought into being as a coherent topic, where it literally emerges from the substrata into meaning. This is the emergence of a resource discourse that parallels the emergence of a new kind of material that comes out of the ground, which these two stories illustrate. They show that as oil becomes a source of wealth, it also curtailed who had the ability to speak. It enabled others to do so. In this instance, voice is not only policy implemented by the province of Manitoba, it is the ability to literally author the material and symbolic landscape of Verdun. Oil gets to tell its story continually through the landscape. Up from the ground comes not only oil, but also meanings of prosperity, stories for different families, and the social and material geography, roads, buildings, monuments, all of which honor the provenance of the resource. So the goal then is to historicize the current practice of fracking, not as a technological formation, not as an environmental or environmentalist formation, but as a set of historical relations. I do this, and I should mention that I've done this work with a colleague of mine, Matt Dice at the University of Winnipeg. So we do this by setting out some of the themes that weave through the narrative, some of these themes that you can see here. And I'd be interested from you all to see, those of you who've read the paper, to see how well some of these themes weave through the narrative, whether or not they actually get pulled through the narrative. Part of the reason for doing this is because the focus on narrative is one of the things that I actually really admire about historians. One of the things that I think is well, no, I'm a geographer, but one of the things I admire about historians is the use of narrative to make arguments and to pull analytical threads through individual pieces. I think that's an extremely difficult, but a really specialized set of skills that historians excel at. So I'm trying to copy you here. The images on the right here, the hydrocarbon horizons and the oil patch, and also reorient our historical thinking a little bit. We can see different kinds of hydrocarbon horizons here. A vertical horizon, a different optic that shows geology instead of geography or history. And so this can orient us spatially, again in Manitoba. A couple of things to point out here. This is southwest Manitoba, which you can see here, the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the border between Manitoba and North Dakota. The place I'm talking about today in the paper is Verdun, and the Daly field just directly beside it. I mentioned Wascata as well in the paper. This formation here, Verdun being right here, Daly right here, this is the end of the Bakken Formation that we hear about in the news all the time in South Dakota and Montana, or in North Dakota and Montana. The thing to point out here is the difference between the black wells, which are historical, conventional wells, and the red wells, which are generally unconventional or multi-stage fracking wells. And this will orient you as well in kind of continental geography. Verdun is near the where the map distinction there, Herkella, points out. I'm going to skip over this. Generally, this is, except to say that this research I'm doing, presenting today is part of a larger project where Matt Dice and I, are looking at this phenomena of what we're thinking of as prairie resource cultures. This is the phenomena of the differentiation between an above-ground resource economy moving into an underground or a subterranean resource economy. We differentiate these between nature, culture, and power. And I'm going to skip over this, but I'm happy to talk more about this larger project later. What I would like to do is point to this concept of inversions that we want to point out. And here's another visual representation of that differentiation between the wheat economy and the oil economy from the late 1950s on. So, inversion, in the first instance, is what happens either when a resource economy switches from something above ground to something underground, when a town or factory appears or disappears from something to nothing. Inversion is about landscape change in dramatic terms. The second instantiation here, inversion, is also a theoretical or an analytical lens that we can use to look at these problems. In this sense, we try to see like social historians who attempt always to find the view from below. In this sense, we seek the landscape from below. The study of landscape is about a kind of a view of the earth from the observer. We try to look at what is outside the observer's view from inside the earth. And third, this inversion is about a cultural material process whereby physical resources are transformed into immaterial flows back into and out of communities, in representation, in wealth, and in other things that flow into and out of communities. So, to Verdun. Coming out of this idea of inversions, what we actually see now are that corporations are aware of that relationship, and they often seek to exploit it. They rely on a discourse of resources as a social or a community good. So you can see there in the bottom left, we've got the Tundra Oil and Gas Place, the brand new community center in Rink, where the Verdun junior oil capitals play. And the Verdun corporate offices in Verdun, the Tundra corporate offices in the top right-hand corner. We've got a Verdun history and Tundra Oil and Gas imprinting itself into the educational landscape of area communities. And I've given you also two different representations of Verdun here to signal some of that entrepreneurial tendency which removes that risk and reward kind of understanding of the landscape. So you can see something taken on the top left from the Verdun Community website and from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where Verdun was underwater in 2014. Southern Manitoba is an extraordinary landscape in that it is a fundamentally wet landscape that has been pumped dry in order to facilitate settlement. And sometimes that doesn't work entirely, as you can see there. Oops. So the key point is that the inversion of these relationships of production into an underground space made this impossible. It's like the new economy of scale that relies on state corporate sponsorship that presents itself as though it's interlaced with local, community, and environmental stewardship. And so we try to see fracking, this current notion of fracking as a historical oil economy that is an embodiment of the lived experience of oil history. So, Imre Zeman, we were chatting about last night, one of the kind of leading lights of this oil cultures, petrocultures approach to oil history, reminds us that oil, in fact, does have a history, but it also has an ontology. And this confronts you right away when you arrive in southwest Manitoba, in Verdun. Oil, in this instance, is foundational to modern life and to notions of freedom and regional identity. Around Verdun, a particular frame of rural Manitoba identity has been reinforced. Oil economies and identities are foundational to a modern masculine rurality that invigorates what many locals speak about as the cowboy mentality. This will be very familiar to the Oklahomans in the room. As one member of the Oil Wives Club that I talk about in the paper, yeah, that's worthy of giggles. The Oil Wives Club member says of her husband in the early 1950s, oil men don't have blood in their veins, they have oil. The junior hockey team, the Verdun Oil Capitals, plays in the brand new Tundra Oil and Gas Place, and they are, as they say, inspired by energy in many different ways. As one local told us, there's no motherhood contra this Oil Wives Club idea of the 1950s. There's no motherhood in apple pie in the oil industry, largely because this cowboy mentality has been fostered within this new entrepreneurial life of risk and reward that I signaled in the last slide. One of the things I do in the paper is to signal that notion of ambivalence. And this ambivalence you can see in different pictorial image representations like this. If fracking is a lived experience that is inspired by oil, it also produces different kinds of ecological responses. These lived experiences also embody the fractured nature of oil histories, of fracking, as a lived experiences. And here you can begin to see how these ambiguities begin creeping in. And of course, it's not just oil that produces these rural historical, resource-based historical identities. There's also other kinds of historical representations, and this is also just to confirm for you that Canadians are quaint. Hockey. This is the Verdun Junior Oil Capitals celebrating the Royal Canadian Mounted Police during an actual game. Where they were then auctioned them off through Tundra Oil and Gas to raise money for another oil-supported education program in the community. And I think this is one of the greatest photos ever taken. Yeah. There's lots to say about this, but we can move past it. So what I do in the paper is, on top of the Fontana and McIver stories, Matt and I look at oil through these three encounters. The first oil encounter is a short history of extractive progress in southwest Manitoba, and this has a really, really simple goal, and that is generally to subvert the idea that Canadian oil history is an Albertan oil story. That's a story that gets told in Canada again and again. It's the story of Leduc, right? And it's the story of the growth of an oil economy, a conventional oil economy in Manitoba, and the great struggle to produce the tar sands through the late 1970s and early 1980s, which is a story of technological and entrepreneurial triumph, and environmental despoliation, and all sorts of other things, but it's a fundamentally Albertan story. And the oil economy in Manitoba is very small, but it's important to Manitoba. The other thing that I want to highlight here in this potted history of Manitoba oil extraction and the context it provides is that the Canadian oil story, like Phil pointed out, like both of you pointed out, the oil economies of Canada are fundamentally continental. They require investment from multinational oil companies. They require infrastructure. They require geological knowledge production from American oil companies, multinational oil companies. And so we can't just write not only can we not just write the Canadian oil history as an Albertan story, we can't write Canadian oil history as a Canadian story. It must be a continental story. The second encounter is the one that I had the most difficulty with. This is this I ran into for both. I'd be interested to hear from you guys what kind of archival encounters you've had doing oil research. This was a fraught exercise. I tried to get historical geological data from the Manitoba government through the archives, through the petroleum branch, which is the arm of the government that controls literally every single part of the Manitoba oil economy, and they stymied me at every attempt. And so what I've done here is changed my original plan, which was to historicize the geology of the province, or the production of geological knowledge in the province. I wanted to ask these three questions. How was geological knowledge produced? How did geological knowledge enter state archives? And how was geological knowledge then circulated from the state to private citizens, private corporations? And here, well, that's all I'll say about that. What wound up happening was a kind of an attempt to historicize the process of fracking, and I'd be interested to hear if any of you have input in what I've done in that short section. The third section is the one I think is the most unique, and that is the idea of providing public history of oil of this small town as a way of talking about the production of oil history in the province of Manitoba. So I grouped this into four different sections, and this is a section that details oil's potential through organizations like the Oil Wives Club, dealing with the social dimensions, through the creation of a two-crop economy, a wheat economy that still persists in the wake of oil, and this new oil economy that is differentiated from oil, but is also working within the same kind of economic and social relations. This oil potential is an interesting frame, and there's lots more to say about this notion of what I'd like to leave with you today is that I think potential, this idea of potential or promise or possibility, is something that historians should pay attention to. It's something to think about within historiography, and it's something to think about as an analytical concept, particularly for resource histories. Potential, and I think I re-gesture at some of that stuff. And there's the notion of these emerging concerns about oil changes, which kind of plays off this notion of potential. In one of the earliest pieces I could find about oil in Verdun, commentator says that in Verdun, nobody's getting rich. In fact, these oil riches, or these riches in oils in town, are accepted philosophically. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it's a kind of rural Manitoba. Well, this is what's happened. It's accepted philosophically. In the paper, I detail some of the concerns around the transient labor economy, the so-called trailerites. These are concerns that are framed around morality, concerns that are framed around space, and concerns that are framed around labor. I also talk about some concerns developing around the longevity of resources. I have a section there around Steve Keegan, which I realize he comes across as a skeptical booster, which is a ridiculous phrase. But he is, in fact, that huge, one of the original oilmen in town who produced the oil economy as mayor in the early 1960s, a massive proponent of the continuation of the oil economy in the late 60s and early 70s. As a private citizen, he warns against the potential failures and downturns of the oil economy, in fact, advocating for basing the economy around manufacturing different kinds of resources, and then as oil potential grows in the wake of the 77 oil boom in North Dakota, he begins advocating for oil again. There's this tension, this constant tension between optimism and uncertainty, which I think I hope comes through in the piece. And then the last element of this third encounter that I want to highlight is the notion that oil is productive of something that you see in rural economies, rural social relations all the time, which is that tension between rurality and the metropolitan area. In this sense, the tension between the local and the provincial dynamic. And that comes through in the development of historical, social, economic relations between the town of Verdun and the central metropolitan area in Winnipeg. Tensions around taxes, roads, the development of social services, who in fact owns the mineral rights, particularly to the oil that exists under the town of Verdun itself. Prices go up, rents go up, there's a lack of space. People are mad because they can no longer find a parking spot when the social on Saturday night comes around. Schools are full. All of these kinds of things are productive of this tension. Which leads us to the ambivalence. As I argue in the paper, this ambivalence in Verdun and Manitoba is characterized less by what Lawrence Buell says is common to American energy histories, which is this exuberance and catastrophe, or this tension between exuberance and catastrophe, but rather it's an ambivalence characterized by accommodation, adaptation, small profits, ambiguous environmental legacies, and considerable state intervention. That doesn't sound like much fun, does it? So just to finish off, we're left with this inversion. We're left with this inversion. The concept of inversion lets us return to the question of why nobody is talking about oil in southwest Manitoba. Nobody's talking about oil, except for the people in Verdun, of course, because oil is with them all the time. This is because the previous resource track of oil has made resources seem incredibly stable. They are grounding features of the area's identity. Even though historicizing oil reveals that the same deep rifts appeared in the 1950s, as you can see in the paper, where people questioned the rapid pace of change. They faced migrant communities looking for work. They faced the gender politics of the male workforce, the environmental consequences, antagonism between powerful corporations and relatively weak employees, private landowners. Yet what remains is the cultural geography of oil's permanence and prosperity. Oil and the fracking economy that has taken up the mantle of oil is always read and interpreted through this apparent stability, with people hoping to return to the good old days of oil in the 1950s. But oil was never permanent. By its very material nature, it's never permanent. In fact, just like fracking, it drew its notion of permanence from an earlier resource, from wheat. In an important sense, oil relied on previous discourses of wheat as a stabilizer and as a foundation for the town. Hence, people understood it in terms of individual prosperity, not in terms of wage labor. They understood it as social, a wives' club, for instance, not in terms of international trade. Wheat was inscribed into the self-understanding of the community. So when we talk about the ontology, or as Zeman says, the becoming of oil, resources, contra Zeman, we need to, and this is reflective of the conversation we had last night, I think you're absolutely right, we need to remember that they exist in both a social and a material formation. Or as Bill said this morning, just now, I'm stealing another quote from my fellow panelists, this energy geography is the product of geology, political economy, and culture. Good, thank you.
Brian, just on the left side of the computer, just pull the plug out, and it'll come off the screen. There you go. Thanks.
So these are three really great papers, and I'm looking forward to talking about them. So more people are calling themselves energy historians these days. This is a relatively new field that has mostly, at least from my perspective, gone out of the environmental history. If you know nothing about energy history, these are my perceptions of the field more broadly. So it kind of grows out of environmental history. I think historians of science and technology are working for ways to fit their work into this category. Literary critics and cultural theorists have also taken up the topic in order to depict and interrogate the various oil cultures that exist and that have grown out of fossil fuel societies. So depending upon the resource under consideration, the scholarship varies and it looks very dissimilar. For example, one energy historian might focus exclusively on production techniques or the history of a particular production of a particular resource, while another may examine consumption patterns. Some scholars may consider the nexus between energy production and its environmental consequences. We see traces of this in all the papers, while others may attempt to link production and consumption of energy as necessary components to understanding the historical context of the energy societies that we've constructed. So I just throw that out because I think it's a vast field, it's an emerging field, but it has a lot of different manifestations. And so energy history looks very different, it's very interdisciplinary, and it just depends upon what you want to achieve in terms of how one's project shapes up. So we have 3 examples of energy history today, and we'll just go through these starting with Philip White, and you prefer Phil, right? Sure. Yeah. Okay, the story of pipelines is an incredibly important topic. Long before Dakota Access, long before Standing Rock, this is a topic that is begged for analysis and begged for somebody to undertake, and I assume that he sees this opportunity and is jumping upon it. So Dakota Access is certainly a reason to get going. It makes for a great hook. I'm not sure that this paper is about Dakota Access. I mean, you mentioned it in the written version and referred to it in the study, but I think it's really a jumping off point for a larger study. The bulk of this paper is an overview of the central role of pipelines and their importance to oil, and he mentions in the written paper natural gas as well, their importance to the Great Plains, including some context in Pennsylvania. As he says in an introductory note that was distributed, this essay is on the long side, and we were looking for some places to maybe cut and think about how to move forward, and so I have a number of thoughts or observations that may help in that effort. Phil describes the encroachment of Standard Oil into the mid-continent oil field. I throw that out because that is a phrase that meant nothing to me before I started thinking about oil, and it may mean nothing to you. And it's also, I think, a useful tip that I struggled over, and is that that's an oil industry term. And often it doesn't really mean much to outsiders, even people who reside here, they just don't recognize it. And I use that as one example of some of the difficulties of doing oil history is that there is an abundance of oil industry literature, and it's often very difficult to climb outside of that. And because the terms like mid-continent, like, and I'll get into this in a minute, conservation and waste, these become terms that the oil industry kind of co-opts and have a very specific meaning. And I think deconstructing some of those meanings is going to be an important task for this project. So it's an oil industry term that's rather vague, and some audiences may not be privy to those connotations. Still, however, the story of integrated oil companies is, who own pipelines could be elaborated upon. At one point in the paper, Phil says, thanks to the power of these pipelines, Standard had complete control of the output in Kansas. I think that's absolutely true for a time, but the question of how much how much control Standard Oil is going to exert in oil-producing communities in Pennsylvania, but outside of Pennsylvania, in oil-producing states like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, even California, this is an incredibly important topic that, again, has been begging for somebody to undertake. I would argue that the degree of standard oil control is highly contested, and I think in that contestation is a great focal point for a book-length project. Joseph Pratt has an article that explains how the Texas legislature at one point passes a law that expressly prohibits Standard Oil from operating within its state. I mean, the monopoly had grown up in Pennsylvania and exerted control over the oil industry, and now all this production is found in the Mid-Continent or the Great Plains region, and they recognize we don't want that monopoly here. That's not to say monopolies don't grow up. In fact, it's not to say Standard Oil doesn't exist here, but through Prairie and other subsidiaries, Standard will kind of reorganize itself and attempt to control those fields, and oftentimes does, as he points out. So much of Oklahoma's early legislative history involves struggles between the so-called independent oil prospectors. These are guys who don't own pipelines, and the larger integrated firms that do own pipelines. This is important because Phil makes the point that pipelines help to control waste, quote unquote, and resulted in conservation. This is an incredibly important idea, the idea of oil conservation, but it's highly politicized, and I would really call for an interrogation of how the oil industry appropriates those terms of waste and conservation and really redefines them. And they become part of the political rhetoric that is actually dividing oil industry producers within the oil industry and through legislative channels both at the state and at the federal levels. This idea of wasting oil. What does waste mean? The independent, the small guys say that waste is economic waste. I've produced all this oil and I've pumped it. Tanks are very expensive, by the way, so I've built these large earthen mounds. I've pumped all this oil that I own into these damned reservoirs, but now I need to sell it, and I don't own a pipeline. It's going to waste. It's going to be wasted if I can't sell it to the pipeline company. The pipeline company says, well, it is going to waste, and it's going to be economic waste if you don't sell it to me for what I'm offering. So let's not engage in economic waste. So this idea of waste gets highly politicized. Waste of labor, waste of oil, waste of effort, waste of dollars. It's a very complicated debate that begs for a historian to interrogate. So it's one that, in all honesty, there is a lot of literature on it, but nobody has really kind of wrapped their arms around it in a comprehensive and understandable way. It's a little scary to me, I must admit, because it involves issues of regulation at the state and federal level. So, yes, pipelines play a significant role in conservation, but that's a story calling for analysis. I have to make reference. So we're dealing with a lot of different themes in all three of these papers. In the written version, Jonathan makes reference to my famous oil industry quotation. You have a milkshake. I have a straw. Read your milkshake. Pick it up. Right? And I think that phrase is really connotes this debate about who owns oil and how they own oil. The people who own oil have straws and they drink the milkshake, right? And I love that because I was kind of in the midst of a lot of these documents when that movie came out. And I said, hey, I know what that means. So, but I mean, think about that. Think about old Daniel Plainview. That's really what he's getting at. And in fact, Standard Oil makes an appearance in that film. But I'd love to talk more about it. So around page 15, the paper begins to provide some context to explain the proliferation of pipelines, referencing the natural gas industry, 1931 Great Lakes pipeline from Tulsa to Minneapolis and Chicago. Seems to be a turning point, but for reasons that I think could be teased out a bit more. Possibly the ability of this powerful technology, this very political technology, to link fossil fuel resources in the plains to distant markets is the reason for significance, which I think you're alluding to. But I also kind of throw that out as a way of possibly connecting all of these papers. I mean, what does energy production look like on the plains? And it's this idea of bridging space that I think some of them get at, all three of them really get at in various different ways. And maybe this is the way to frame this idea of pipelines on the plains. A technology that helps to bridge the gap between these urban and rural centers where the resources reside. There's some additional discussion as the paper moves on about oil in World War II, the big inch and little inch pipelines, Northern Great Plains pipeline in Canada. I think with the stuff that I mentioned on Standard Oil and the integrated companies, that by itself is a pretty big topic, and I might avoid some of the World War II and forward content. So another important point, though, circling back to the contestation of who owns oil, you mentioned that labor unions will protest some of these pipelines, but also the independent oil producers are protesting these pipelines. I mean, the Connolly Hot Oil Act, they're literally blowing up pipelines. The idea of who owns pipelines is regulated at the local level. The oil industry designates umpires to sit at wellheads and regulate, literally count, how much oil each producer is taking from a well and dictating the terms of production. This occurs at a local level. Oklahoma is the first state to pass oil conservation legislation, okay, I think in like 1913 or something. But other states will follow suit, and of course Texas and the Texas Railroad Commission become the dominant story because of the massive production of the East Texas oil field. But all of these different states are struggling with this issue, these battles that are being fought among oilmen over pipelines. And pipelines are really the turning point in this battle. The Connolly Hot Oil Act is an attempt to prevent smuggling of oil. They say that people are smuggling oil across state lines to engage in this global trade. Again, there's some literature on it. It needs to be teased out. You have some great opportunities here to do this. So those are just some possibilities for focusing in as you move forward. Thinking about some of those section breaks and focusing on some of the stuff that I mentioned. Again, Dakota Access, of course, is a really interesting story. I'm not sure that it's germane to this. And then you had Cushing on one of your maps. I checked again. No mention of Cushing. We talked about it in our discussions over dinner. I've had a chance to talk to all of these folks, and so it's been a lot of fun to have those conversations leading up to this as well. Another couple of books that are pivotal, particularly with regard to the Kansas standard battle, is Francis Schrugen from Weed Creek to El Dorado. And then Arthur Johnson's book, I know it's great reading for everybody, Petroleum Pipelines and Public Policy. It is actually a really brilliant book that I think is certainly not the last word on this, but it's going to be a great reference for you as you move forward. So Ryan Tate's paper relates the story of late 1960 coal extraction in the Bull Mountains region of southern Montana to explain how local environments are cast as places of overburden. I have to kind of play that up because he's talking about how local environments get remade where mining and reclamation take place and disrupt the social power, or social relationships that people have to the land. Overburden, though, and I could say that again, overburden. It's this industry term that I think that he mentions, but it has this kind of Orwellian, ominous connotation to it. It's really creepy, I have to say. But it's this idea that soil, plants, rock, animal life, the ecosystem is disposable. Tate argues that the term connoted a cultural and economic place. Homes and workscapes of white ranchers in northern Cheyenne and Crow Indians who lived and worked near the coal fields. And he argues that an examination of the material life of the overburden, as well as the people who lived nearby, helps to explain some of the protests that erupted in the 1970s, late 1960s and 70s. Tate tells us that technology was central to this story. So there's a lot going on in this paper that I think really speaks to the themes of this workshop. Open bowl scrapers resembled large dump trucks, large blades that piled up the overburden the ecosystem in many hills. Drillers dynamited and blasted rocks to break up the earth and related coal seams. So I think it's a really kind of juicy part of your paper, and I think that it's just really helps people get their head around the scale. Again, I thought of Phil's paper as well in terms of the scale of development and change that's taking place here in order to create these energy industries. Derek Dochuk actually has a piece. He's writing a book on oil and religion, and he has a piece on tar sands production. He talks about the innovation of earth movers and how these earth movers help to, in the oil sands region, help to undertake this excavation on a massive scale. Of course, Adam Rome's book on bulldozer in the countryside. I mean, I never fully appreciated what suburbanization looked like until he laid it out, and how fundamentally these bulldozers just turned ecosystems into flat, scraped earth. There's a woman a woman has a book called Bulldozer Demolition and Clearance of the Post-War Landscape at University of Pennsylvania Press. You might think of that too. So coal extracted from the Great Plains fueled Midwestern cities hundreds of miles away. So this argument, this attempt to link coal production in the plains to these urban centers is reminiscent of Andrew Needham's book, Power Lines. Needham's on this committee, right? And so, of course, you're gonna, it's an influential and important book, and that's gonna frame your argument, as I think it has in some useful ways. Local communities and Native Americans bear the brunt. It resembles Needham's work in the sense that these rural communities, white ranchers, Native Americans, bear the brunt of urban centers who are using this coal to light their cities. But that's okay, apparently, because the coal industry helps to reclaim these lands, right? This is another really interesting and compelling part of this story. Unfortunately, the science of reclamation, as he states, was rough and experimental. The coal industry uses this rudimentary state of reclamation science to its own advantage by coining terms like overburden. It uses this rhetoric to reclaim grasslands on its own terms. So again, and he mentions the demonstration sites. I mentioned this to him in passing, so I'll just kind of summarize again. But as a way to sell these reclamation efforts, they established these demonstration sites to show people that, look, we're returning the land back to its productive capacity, back to nature. The oil sands has the same gig going on. There's an oil industry sponsored tour in which they take you to the production site, and then they take you to the reclaimed lands. And they are reclaimed. I don't see any oil around, there's no smokestacks, but it looks kind of like a golf course. All in a row, perfect row. So nature has triumphed again, right? So sure, the land's been reclaimed, but at what cost? This seems to be a question that Brian is asking, one that seems central to this workshop in many of the papers that have been presented. How does such systematic destruction of the overburden alter one's relationship to place and their sense of identity? How do energy technologies create, alter, and sustain identities? Jonathan asked similar questions in his paper as well. I would be remiss without also emphasizing, I think, the importance of grass in this paper. Native grasslands were atop 60% of the coal resources in the area, and grass became a central issue for accumulating wealth. Tate argues that grasslands are important to the region and that controlling those grasslands became a political enterprise. I think this is a really important idea, and I beg you to remember this when we go to the Tallgrass Prairie tomorrow. It was very palpable when traveling with our speaker tomorrow to central Montana, just north of the area north of the area you're talking about, where ranchers greatly privilege cattle over bison and resist and resent efforts to reintroduce bison, because capital equals cattle, and that means cows eating grass, and controlling those grasses is not only economically important, it's culturally important, and removing bison and particularly native people who want to reintroduce bison, or a bunch of non-local yuppies who are coming in to rehabilitate landscape, what are you doing here? Get off of my grasslands with your bison. I mean, you know, we're, I can't speak for we, but there's something that I think you will all agree tomorrow, magnificent about seeing bison on grasslands. They don't share that sentiment. I think it's an important idea to remember. There's a book, by the way, that really gets at the politics of this Nathan Sayre book called Grass. And then, of course, water, too. He makes the point about how fundamentally important water was to the production of coal. And this reminds me of how fundamentally important water is to the issue of fracking. Water, nobody's talking about water. We're talking about seismicity, and we're talking about energy production, but none of that happens without vast amounts of water being used to fuel pumps, so to speak. So as you move forward, I would find it helpful. I would say keep building upon the material that you have here and expanding upon it. It would be useful for me as a reader to hear a little bit more about how you have come to the term political ecology and how you have your understanding of it and what sources you're drawing upon to frame your work. Where do you see this work within the context of energy history? Do you see it as an energy history? And if not, what other works might inform your work? And the true of Phil and Ryan, I would just ask as somebody participating in the workshop to think about how you see your work in relationship to the Great Plains. Do you see these histories as endemic to the Plains? And I mean, you can easily make the arguments that they are, but if so, how are they? So I'm going to move on and wrap up with Jonathan's paper. Jonathan Payton depicts the cultural and historical ambivalence when fuel and extractive economies in the oil industry, in particular, arrive in Plains communities. On the one hand, oil's arrival begets great wealth for some, but for others, it leaves behind stories of despair and natural despoliation of natural environments. He relates his themes through those two episodes that he provides an overview of. I want to not repeat those overviews because he has done a good job at that, and I also want to save plenty of time for questions. The overview, he and I talked about this last night. The overview that he provides makes reference to seismic surveys as opposed to geological ones. An incredibly important topic, one that I'm currently interested in researching. How some of the material that he presented toward the end of his paper, I think really gets at an important direction this paper may take, and an important field of energy history that really nothing has been written on. Industry insiders have written about this, but the idea of geophysical and seismic exploration, the science and technology of oil exploration post-1920. How do we find all this oil? Well, we find it through a massive investment of industrial research and development dollars. Who has those dollars? Oil industry, oil companies do, and it's actually quite sophisticated. And I have to make this point because I think that fracking and the seismicity that has resulted from it, guess what? That matters. Easy argument to make here. If you don't live here, you know, Oklahoma's had thousands, I think it's 3,500 earthquakes last year. I lived in the epicenter of it. Having said that, and then moved to Kansas City and felt an earthquake centered in Oklahoma, Josh and I both did. But this technology that is not necessarily happening because of fracking. It's happening because of fluid induction, right? Unregulated fluid induction. And lo and behold, some regulation has begun to unfold in Oklahoma, and the fracking has been, the earthquakes have been minimized to some extent. The only point that I want to make is that Jonathan's mission to interrogate how geological knowledge is constructed is an immensely important idea, and one that I think, for the energy industry, and one that I think invites plenty of additional scholarship.
Another important point he makes is one I just alluded to, and that is state intervention. It's an issue that he touches upon, that Phil touches upon, and it is one that I think for oil and energy industries more broadly, we as historians need to do a lot more work on this. So, and then the last section that he covers is the case study on Virgin Manitoba and the kind of cultural history in terms of how the oil industry kind of situates itself in a community by doling out dollars and naming community centers and sports teams. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that for our my good friend and our future commenter here, Sterling Evans, I've conducted a tour, an oil and gas bus tour, 2 different times in which we've gone through sites looking at similar places like schools, local elementary schools, that are named after oil industry related entities. So anyway, I guess I just would say again that I think there are enormous opportunities that many of the literary folks and the theorists have undertaken. Stephanie Lemeninger's book, Living Oil. Again, we talked about this quite a bit. I think the historians do a better job at articulating relevance and significance. Some of that stuff I find difficult to understand. But the role of culture, the role of gender, the Oil Wives Club. This is a topic, oil and gender, that is screaming for additional study. Gender in the oil industry manifested itself in a number of different ways. The wives of oil industry workers were one important manifestation of that. However, even here at the University of Oklahoma, women who took some of the first petroleum geology classes participated not fully and in the same ways that men did, but took field trips down to the Arbuckle Mountains. There are some great photos in the Western History Collection that we're about to go to with women in these long Victorian-era skirts sitting on hills excavating fossils. Excavating fossils that would later be used for geology classes. And then women go into micropaleontology in great numbers to conduct historical research for gaining strata in the oil industry. So
pictures are in his book too, by the way.
Thanks for the plug, Sterling. I'll give you the ISBN here in a minute. Okay, so but this doesn't come without anxiety. This is not a win-win story. It's a story in which the efforts to situate themselves in these communities instill a degree of anxiety. And again, how can we not think about the disruption that has occurred in North Dakota with Bakken oil development? NPR did a series of stories where they talked about sex trafficking, massive drug abuse, the trailerites, man camps, influx of a large number of men, and which meant a disproportionate share of power for women in a number of different ways. So overall recommendations, I would say that I think that all of these papers in some respect speak to the ways in which the energy industry transforms space on the plains, whether it's through pipelines, strip mining, or even the cultural landscape. Space is being transformed. Environmental changes may be so profound that we've talked yesterday about issues of scale, and that the period of introduction of the horse was actually a relatively small period of time, but precipitated dramatic transformations. Maybe this is the kind of dramatic transformation, another instance of such change. Mobility. All of these papers address this theme in one way or another. Mobility is endemic to the plains. People follow food in the form of bison, but people must travel in order to do so. Energy enables mobility in the form of grass, bison, meat, fossil fuels. Each paper explores this in more, could explore it in more depth. Rural-urban core periphery divide. Each of these papers really speaks to this. Of course, I mentioned Needham, Cronin. There are a number of ways to think about the Great Plains as being at the center of these spatial dynamics that I think shape the energy industry in important ways, and perhaps they will articulate that further. So now I'm going to stop talking and open up the session for comments. So who wants to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
First of all, 3 wonderful papers and a wonderful comment from Ryan. Thank you. I was, in some ways, I was thinking these papers represent a very abrupt transition from yesterday. And yet in other ways, I thought Phil's paper was a really intriguing way to start because it reminds us of a theme that I think is emerging here, which is the plains as a corridor of different types of mobility. And we see that certainly with Phil's paper, and something that shifts our orientation, not just simply east-west mobility, but multi-directional mobility, and certainly Phil's paper brings that out. I actually had the same things about the themes, questions written down about the state and hinterland and core. I have a different question for Ryan and Jonathan. And quite frankly, it's a question that really challenged me when we were working on the Energy Capitals book. As a person who has written about Denver and more traditional extractive economies, hinterlands and cores, are these energy landscapes in the end just modern expressions of older extractive economies with boom and bust cycles, ultimately patterns of environmental degradation? Or is there something fundamentally different about fossil fuels? And if there is, what is it that's fundamentally different in terms of the extractive economy?
That is.
That's why I passed. Oh, we don't get people.
That come to mind readily. One is the issue of scale. I think in energy economies, extractive economies generally, the scale of the endeavor, the scale of economic prosperity and environmental despoliation are dramatically increased. So that is Darcy's well scale. I think for sure that is important. And the other thing that I think is different about energy economies, which I alluded to in my comments today, is the different content. We can't see energy economies, or we can't see extraction. There's an invisibility and immateriality to oil, that oil particularly, maybe a little bit less so with coal, because you can see it on the landscape. With oil, can't see it, and so it's an extremely difficult resource to parse culturally. Because it's invisible, it allows regulatory agencies to react differently to it. They can govern through uncertainty. The kind of regulatory mechanisms to govern oil doesn't have to be as stringent as it does for something else. Another kind of extractive economy, or wheat for that matter. Capital can act differently around oil because it can't be seen. Really, the extraction process is invisible. And so I think that notion of visibility, or the verticality that I was talking about, makes for a different kind of process.
So, yeah, I think those are really good points. When I began my project, I really didn't think of energy economy like a contemporary sort of version of like maybe a boom and bust story, and I kept writing and really got to the busts. Because I realized that these mines are still active. You have short construction booms, but it's a different sort of political economy. This is what I got to, is that I think that it actually does reshape the entire political economy across some of these regions in a more long-term perspective. And part of that has to do with the fact that you have a rise of sort of multinational energy companies. So the coal company is now owned by oil companies. And so there's an incentive to sort of maintain sort of a long-term profitability in the industry. And yeah, I think that all points to what Jonathan made.
Yeah, I think you're both right. I think you're both right, and I do think there are things we don't talk about much, but for example, the legal mechanisms that emerged in the 19th century that allow for this accumulation of capital, that has underwritten this type of the scale you're talking about. or recognizing how changes in technology make the scale much more vital. Or even things that John McNeil talks about in his book, Something New Under the Sun, and how fossil fuels change the global economy on a scale never seen before. So scale, I think is really key as well. Thanks.
Can I add one more thing about technology to that, just John? Technology is extraordinarily bold as productive of fun, but the flip side of that is that technological innovation, particularly in oil, has also produced the scaling up of those economies, which uses the oil market.
Right,
So,
which is a big part of McNeil's argument.
It produces booms, but it also produces, like, busts are now endemic to technology.
Mm-hmm.
Hands over here. Anyone?
One of the things that struck me about all three of these papers is they are about language and narrative. And they're also about gender, not women, gender and masculinity. I think you have to really keep your eye on the masculine construction of some of this stuff and the linguistic masculine construction, including things like attention getting, hierarchy, that kind of arguing over rules, these traditionals or small group. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about how is there a kind of display that goes on, and how do the narratives that come out of your own companies get transferred into the narratives that you tell in law, which means that that narrative has won some sort of legislative approval and thus has become encoded in the rules for how things are run.
I make a big space for gender, big part of some of the debate. And one of the big arguments actually that I find is actually when you look at, I think brute force labor or something. The other thing is that they actually think that women are going to sort of domesticate the minds, and that there will be less union activity or less militancy if there's more women present. And so they create these ideas of sort of family kinship in the minds. They're going to have to go around sort of shift work through in order to keep people in sort of this feeling of kinship without animosity towards them. So that's gender is actually kind of other strategy. Because they have had to deal with sort of genetic workers for so long that they're looking to start new with their whole culture. So, and that's, I mean, that's a complex subject.
So definitely with the petroleum industry more broadly, I mean, there's so many gendered terms going on here. You know, you think about wild catting, like oil is this wild beast that you have to hunt, that you have to track down. And that, you know, in the regulatory space, the rule of capture, you know, that you're required. There's a certain mechanisms that you're required to undergo to bring the oil out of the ground. And I think those are phenomenally gendered terms, and you know the first oil matters, you know, are almost, to my knowledge, all men. But in pipelines, it's harder. You know, I haven't. There's tons of gender dynamics in the oil industry, but then pipelines, you know, I haven't found the gender dynamics or fascinating gender stories I'm looking for. But what I think is really stark, and we'll see if Standing Rock eventually comes into my paper, but if you want to contrast the man camps in North Dakota and the horrific gender dynamics that are going on there with the social dynamics of Standing Rock as a predominantly women-led indigenous resistance, I mean, that I think is a phenomenally evocative set of images, and I would like to be able to do something with that to kind of push back a lot of the control.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right, and I'm dying to find out more about the other life stuff we get. But there's a million ways to answer your question, and one way is to talk about the particular Canadian constitutional context, which frames mineral rights around settlement, and there are different constitutional settlement regimes depending on what province you're in. So the one party about that, but it's always those mineral rights are always held by the male-headed family, those settlers. Another way to frame it is through this idea of risk and uncertainty that I talk about a little bit, which is fundamentally tied to that cowboy masculinity, cowboy mentality around and presumably everywhere else where there's a large oil farm. And the last thing to say is that there is a PhD student in geography at Penn State who's writing about gender dynamics in the Marcellus Shale. And it's Ariel. So I can't remember her last name, but she's doing some really good work on gender.
Yeah, I had a suggestion for each of you, and it's not a thoughtful, overarching thematic suggestion, but because these were so provocative, exciting, all three presentations, as well as the comment, there were these specific northern plains or plains stories about history that came to mind that could connect or maybe enrich what each of you were doing. So I offered them up, their work would be paid for. Phil, I was thinking about, when I read your paper, then listening to you, thinking about the powerful role of farmer petroleum cooperatives. Like that Clearbrook station, I'm pretty sure it comes out of Midland. I think 30 to 40% of petroleum on the plains by the 80s is controlled by these farmer cooperatives that grow out of the old producer cooperatives, but are consumer cooperatives. And they are obviously proposing an alternate political economy, and yet they're profoundly complicit in these pipeline systems. At the local level, and I think by the time you get economies of scale in the 70s and 80s, places like Senex in the United States at least are actually thinking about pipelines and this much broader than you are. But thinking about farm cooperatives as consumers, trying to fuel those cars and tractors, and how big of a role they play in this production of these pipeline systems, I think could really make your analysis even thicker. Brian, I was thinking about the Cold War, and especially the forms of rural protest around the power that's inherent in grass, the caloric power, the solar power, the economic power in grass. And I was thinking of Gretchen Huebner's The Missile Next Door, and how she identifies how the placement of missiles in the 60s and 70s across the northern plains produces protest. And I'm wondering if there are intersections there, because obviously, as you probably point out in your broader project, coal is a Cold War, and you talked about energy independence. But to see if there are any connections between that local protests on the ground that really troubles our categories about rural people and the kind of politics of how they imagine government. And it's around the resource, but in this case, it's the government playing sites. There's got to be. I just, oh my God, it's the same space. What are those intersections? And then, Jonathan, I love what you said at the end about the ways in which discourses of wheat that were much older and more deeply embedded in the cultures of southwestern Manitoba were shaping the ways in which people imagined oil culture. And I wanted you, or maybe Ken, you just maybe know a room there are a lot of cool things going on. But the persistence of the small producer identity. It seems to me that's what you're describing. And the ways in which that obscures a very different relationship to global markets, to global culture and practices. The way, as you pointed out, the way in which it obscures wage labor and the significant role of transient wage labor. Small producers had a relation to that in the early 20th century, sure. But this notion of the small producer mentality, or even mentality, and how that is affecting oil culture. That was really intriguing. So just possibilities and threats. Super exciting.
Can we, since he put those in the form of a statement and not a question, can we swing over to Maria since she had her hand up?
We have only a 15-minute break this morning, so let's do one question and then,
one question,
because I want people to have time to.
Maybe we can pose the question and chat.
Yeah, no, I was just very interested in the issue of you bringing up the Dakota pipeline, you talking about the grow and coal energy, because I mean the grow industry, because my impression of came from the Blackfeet tribe and the Swift tribe, were both oil all tribes, is that there is a very different attitude between energy tribes and non-energy tribes, which, interestingly enough, most of them are Sioux. But the energy tribes have managed to negotiate the sacredness of the land and this whole holistic conservation idea of everything is sacred, we are sacred, do not touch it, we're the only ones who can conserve, right? But the energy tribes have negotiated something about areas that can be used for energy and areas that are non-negotiable, right? Like, for example, we had a case, we needed to cancel a lot of leases along the Rocky Mountain Front in the budget of medicine, and we succeeded, except for one lease from Solonex and from Solonex. And what the tribe said was like, here are the best seismic readings in the reservation. Let's swap. You cancel the lease in our most sacred mountain, and you can go and get all the oil you want from this other part of the reservation. We negotiate, and that would be wonderful. See, whereas when you go to people, to tribes that do not own the energy, that they cannot exploit that energy, you have this holistic conservation and grassroots protests, because they see that others benefit from it, but they don't themselves. And I don't think that is as ideologically or religious connotation wise as it is political and economic.
So with that, we're going to